Hi, Joe. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Rosie's here to guide me through my. This is our fifth and last tape together.
Right. And I think we're going to call this tape Writing, Retirement, and the Hope for a Spring of Springs, right? That's the sort of the
No, that's
topic.
the title I want to
Okay,
give it,
good.
and
And
I
I,
do want to thank you for doing the interviews, and I want to thank Rosie for facilitating all the things that I'm pretty clumsy about, and that's a lot of things.
no, and I want to thank Rosie too. But before we get started, Joe, I want to ask a couple of questions. How many books now have you written?
Uh, it gets kind of dicey because I've co-authored books too. Do I
Mm-hmm.
count
You
those?
count them. Yeah, you can count those too.
Yeah, well, I'm going to just say, and it's going to be an estimate, then 30 some,
30 some books.
31,
Mm-hmm.
32, like that.
And how many different languages have your books been translated into?
Well, let's see, German, Italian, Japanese. Well, that was a poem, one poem in Japanese, and a major book in Korean, and then in a Slavic language. It could be Slovenian, but I need my son Tony to ask him what language it is. That's the
Uh-huh.
dust book.
Okay. Yeah, I just think it's important to say that because writing has been a really big part of your life and a major part of your professional life. And even now, today, you're still writing. And so I just wanted to make that note and let's have you start. And we can just start with where you want to begin and to talk about your writing and what it means and what that title means about writing, retirement, and hope for a spring of springs.
Okay, great. Thanks. There are three parts to this talk, and the first is longer, the longest, but it could be a lot longer. It's very minimal. But the first part is called I wrote, and yet write on, meaning that it started, and it all started in fellow teachers, although he was an older man who flew an airplane in World War II. He wrote a wonderful book on Hemingway. His name was Deb Wilder. And out of the blue, something like you volunteered. He said, "Oh, I'd like to read your dissertation and get it in shape for the committee." And so he corrected the English and he kept telling me, to my surprise, how good it was. And finally, when I was all done on the last day, Deb Wilder, his name was, said to me, "Joe, who's going to publish your book?" And I was absolutely floored by that proposition that someone would publish something I wrote. So that was a big surprise. And then again, to my utter surprise, the first two presses I sent it to immediately sent me back acceptances. One was the University of Toronto Press, but I was young and not necessarily naive, but I felt obligated to take the first offer. So I did take the first offer, which is another good university press, but not quite the status of Toronto. And I had two books published right away because the man who took the book at the University of Alaska, so much like my way of going at things, he offered to publish a small little book I wrote, which most people don't know about. It's called Ethics, Living or Dead. It's my study of Rousseau, Marx, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Camus, Sartre, and Mounier, who was the central person in my study of French Catholic thought in the 20th century. So was that too quick? Is that all right, what I just said?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, anyhow, I had taken the intersection of writers. I mean, excuse me, I'd taken writers, the almost entirety of their work. I don't mean all their letters and small things, but the entirety of their main books as a way to get at the history of ideas. and then get at the history of meaning. I was always trying to read the third or fourth book by an author. And so they became my door to a general view. And then shortly after, I took a second step. I dared to try to trace the intersection of values and power, because I was a longtime believer in Lord Acton's saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In other words, any idea, however good, as soon as the state gets a hold of it, and that could mean the nation state, it can transform it into not just an administration, but transform it into a superior power. So I started on that theme, and I wrote two more books. One was called Guilt and Gratitude. Now, my argument was, oh, this could be very complicated to explain this book, but my argument was there were two great poles at work in the modern world. One was a kind of guilt that we weren't perfect. That guilt was common among liberals, university professors. They always were seeing how shy we were of total perfection. That was almost one way of creating morality. But an older way of creating morality was gratitude and its sister, and probably larger sister, reciprocity. I give you, you give me back. Oh my God, what a gift. How will I ever pay you? I can't repay you. So that's gratitude. Oh, we'll never be totally perfect. That's perfection. Anyhow, I saw that battle playing out everywhere, and I won't tell you how. I first found it played out on the streets of Cottonwood over a cannon that the vets installed in the middle of the Vietnam War. And then how one professor, not me, but one of the professors, thought celebrating war on any terms during the Vietnam War wasn't leading us to the perfect world. So that was a book called Guilt and Gratitude. But then I followed it up with a book called Victims and Values. And in that book, I was taken by how much we turn victims, lump them together, make them victims. We make ourselves the representatives of them. And we consolidate and usurp their suffering into them being the victims. And therefore, the world owes them because it victimized them. And I saw that as a very modern new ethics. And it obviously goes back to Marx and the French Revolution, where Marx has his proletariat, and on it goes. But joining the suffering, representing the suffering, and being the power of the suffering, that's the final stage, I saw that as a very interesting modern dialectic. So those were two books. So, okay, very abstract. They had good academic publishers. They got quite a bit of attention. But at the same time, I was working on family, my Sicilian family, my father, my mother's mixed Wisconsin family. And then what I discovered, my grandmother's maiden name, my mother's mother, was Boudry, but originally it was Boudreau. And I won't tell you how much effort I put into it. But then the discovery was she indeed was French. And she wasn't just French Canadian. She was a French Acadian. And her most distant relative came to Acadia in 1640. And her family was part of that great expulsion of Acadians in 1755, the first great movement of people in North Africa. A lot of them drowned in seas. A lot of them were locked out of every colony port. So they even some of them walked all the way from places down south all the way back to Quebec City just to find a place to lay their head. It was a stunning thing. Our family only got deported, you might say, as prisoners of war and serfs in Massachusetts. So my early family has a history of poverty in Massachusetts. So of course they went where a lot of the poor in Massachusetts go, who wouldn't be given firewood anymore. They went up to Maine to try to colonize Maine. It's not a good place for a wheat farm, Maine, put it that way. So our family had a marvelous history, and I got intrigued by the marvelous family history. So whenever I looked at history, I never forgot Sicily, or I never forgot a village in Acadia. And that added to my dimensions of understanding. So let me
Let me ask a question.
Yeah,
So
sure, please.
you found this out after you had done your work on in after you'd done your work in French Canada, and all of this was discovery after all of that, right?
Oh yeah, all
what
of
a
this.
surprise that was in terms of
Yeah,
bringing all that together.
absolutely. Then, if we could go further into it, I like French Canadian folklore. I did learn that Acadian folklore was older than Quebec folklore. And I even learned later that Acadian stories are of the same vintage of Rabelais. And Rabelais was probably one of, if not one of my primary inspirations for the book I wrote, the novel called Buffalo Man. The body, humor, and I'd love to retell Rabelais stories here. It'd be more fun than what I'm doing, but
no, this is good. This is very good, and it's I just think it's so neat that you found this out after all of this stuff that you were doing, how you learned French and all this, and you find out that actually that goes back to being a part of your own genesis, part of your own family. So
yeah, it was stunning, and they kicked around the name Boudry, and it could sound like the British booty, and they kicked the name around, but through my own work and the work of a marvelous French folklorist who was in Maine, we went to Quebec Records, and they are Priestley Catholic Records, excuse me, and they led in a very short time back to Acadia, which is just marvelous. And then in Massachusetts, my family and its poverty and its complaint about being forced to cut wood, not paid for the wood it cut, turned up in the Massachusetts Supreme Court. So I learned a lot about Massachusetts, and just being it's the time of everyone's talking about the Declaration of Independence. A thing the show on TV the other night didn't mention was John Adams, his colony, Massachusetts, was the largest debtor to England of all the colonies. And I started to wonder which colonies had big debts and which hardly had debts, and how that might suggest how intense they felt about a revolution. And I did find that Massachusetts, the core, was the biggest debtor of the colonies.
wow.
So it's sort of, maybe without letting the cat out of the bag, the kind of work you're finding out on the Masters golf tournament. Right. So, and aside from family, it was not necessarily my intention, but we needed students. I mean, if you knew our condition and all that, getting in students was crucial. And the word was FTE, full-time equivalency. And we had some nasty nicknames for it. starting with Up Your FTE badges we put out. And but anyhow, one of the courses I taught, and I taught several, history of sports and all over the map. But I taught right at the time it was popular. In fact, I wrote an article or two on it. But I wrote when death, dying, and aging had kind of become fashionable. It was a thing. And it led me to write a book called Death Book, Terrors, Consolations, Contradictions, and Paradoxes. The cover should have been a light blue, but the guy who printed it skipped it. Hold me up for me, Rosie. And it is a drawing by an Italian that I liked, Umberto, I think. Anyhow, in the book, I found it was natural for me to put in aphorisms. I put in poems I wrote. I'll be reading one or two of those later on. And I enjoyed free writing styles, mixing an essay, a poem. And I referred to the death book as terrors, consolations, contradictions, and paradoxes, and that squared with my youthful concern with dying. And had good students in there. They got interested in it, and we looked at death in a lot of different cultures, and I got a little feel for it, and I hope they did too. And then much later, we're in the 1980s. I'm just 50 years old, and I was diagnosed with significant heart blockage. And in 1993, I underwent what they call a quadruple bypass, meaning they used a mammary artery to jump two outside coronary arteries on the left side. And then they used another two veins to skip another place. And I underwent that when you weren't sure you were coming back to the land of the living when you went under there. In fact, one nurse said to me, "Oh, don't worry. When you wake up, it looks like the people from the outside will be able to look in at you." And she went on to explain, but the glass blocks outside views coming in. And I don't think I said to her, but I told the next person who came by, I don't care if they see my bare hinder through the glass. If I'm alive, that's good enough for me. So anyhow, I wrote about the death book, who if I died, if I could meet anyone who I'd want to meet. And I had a lot of, I can't say a lot of fun, but a lot of exploration doing not just the death book, but then the bypass book, which was my coming to terms with death. And it's probably not altogether accidental, but my father had died in 1989. So it was a period when, sort of in middle age, when you begin to encounter things like I could die, or the people I was close to die. Now, there were other things going on. Always, if I were a breeder of dogs, I don't think all my dogs would be refined dogs. They'd all be very, very mixed mongrels. And while I was dealing with death and bypass and family subjects and working on rural and regional studies in Southwest Minnesota, I got a National Endowment grant to go out to UCLA with Eugen Weber. And it's there I started to turn fairly high intellectual history into cultural and social history. And meaning I made it more popular, it penetrated more classes. Instead of asking what is beauty and make arguments about who said what about beauty, you get more interested in who got the first mirror. What did they do with the first mirror? Where did they hang the first mirror? Or when did people get bedding? When did people get a chair to sit in? How come peasants have strong haunches? And mainly it's because they sit on their haunches a lot. And the old thing of why do you want to marry a gal that's a good hard stomper at a dance? Because that hard stomping can be carried into work on your farm. You don't want a lightweight. You want to get some. And I saw that lived out in Marshall, where the Belgian women who would get a bottle of whiskey put in front of them at a wedding, but they almost all were suffering arthritis in their shoulders and knees. And why? Because the husbands gave them the unlikable jobs, but somebody had to do it, and they couldn't be out in the field and do it too. They carried the milk buckets out of the farm. And if you start carrying milk buckets and you got a few cows and it's winter, you know the story of farming. It can get pretty tough.
For sure.
At the same time, my confidence as a writer grew, because shortly after, and by shortly after 10, 12 years after the seminar, I started to publish books like Dust, A History of the Small and Invisible, which was a new exploration of history. Here's somebody taking on dust. And then I followed it up. That was published in 2000 and 2004. I wrote a book on the history of walking. I talked about that before, and I didn't mean prancing and dancing, although I was very interested in people who would tell me the rich people had smooth floors and slid their feet. The peasants had to lift their boots up and stomp them. And then barns and floors and all that. It got very interesting. But I wrote a history on foot, which was a prolonged history of walking from our beginnings. And then I wrote a book which I think is quite imaginative. It got quite a bit of attention in England, but it never really spread as much as I liked. It's fairly philosophic. It was called On Surfaces. And the simplest idea on surfaces is we are a set of surfaces that encounters a world as a set of surfaces. So it's how we rub up against, touch, feel surfaces, and how surfaces come back and touch us. And I carried that history of surfaces from primitive people up to modern plastics. Making smooth surfaces is one of the great accomplishments of industry. People like things smooth. And a characteristic of being a peasant, the roads are rough, your skin is rough, life is rough, there's splinters everywhere. And today, if you bought an appliance and got a splinter off it, you're liable to start a court case larger than Trump or Biden could create. Anyhow, you get the idea. So yeah. I got very interested in things like the history of romance. Oh, when did people get hearts that fell in love, and the history of all that? I found all that utterly fascinating, and I somewhat joined it as successfully as I could in a book called Everyday Life. This more recent book. It's 2016. Everyday Life, How the Ordinary Became Extraordinary. And dealing a lot with the history of technology. And if I can say a word about that, that goes back when I was an undergraduate. I was at the Michigan Library just reading in the shelves, their new undergraduate library. And one of the books was in there was essays by Lewis Mumford and his book on technology. And I read his history of the clock. And that goes all the way back when I was a sophomore or senior. I was interested in how do we keep time?
Mm-hmm.
And now we keep time all over the damn place. There's a tick or a tock wherever you go, where one time it was the sun. And the sun measured when you better get home, when you da 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 da. So all of that went on. And it certainly, if anybody gets interested, they must look at my website, Amato.com, or look at Wikipedia, and they can see the books, the articles, even some of the book reviews for me were fairly large and of important subjects. But one vein was running through my work that I only became aware of. It was an important vein in the last 15 years or 10 years, and that's poetry kept cropping. I didn't ever mean to be a poet, but poetry kept a vein, and they grew into a larger set of veins, or being we got a medical person here, I should say, damn near became an artery of my system. There's poetry, and I thought, being I didn't start with a few poems, I'd read a few poems just to end this section. They're short, and then
Sure.
go on to section 2. Is that all right?
That's fine, for sure.
Okay. I need page 104, Rosie, Winter Peace Dance. Is that in there? Yeah, that one's the one I want. I want 101. Yeah. Here's the first poem, and we'll get to 104. The first poem, 101. I think, Jim, you've been a teacher. When a student of yours commits suicide, that can really and it doesn't rattle you, but it and it's more than, say, a cliche like catches your fancy. It sticks on your mind. Or when a
Right.
fellow colleague commits suicide. We had a swimming coach who no sooner left our school and he was lost. And I wrote a long poem to him, and I'd like to read that too. I won't, but I'll read the one to the student. Brilliant student, but never could find his place, it looked like, among other students or where he belonged. And one day he walked out into the cold at somebody who'd taken him in out of the cold, and he snuck out the door and he froze to death. And here's the poem to him. It's called A Winter Peace Dance. God is cold, and I am lost along the road again. For the last 12 years, I kept getting lost. My blue eyes, and he had terribly blue eyes, grow paler all the time, losing hold of what they are. I'm in front of the farmhouse. I'm walking around it, swirling like the snow, seeing the house and not seeing it. Its light, this snow, my loss. They guide me in and ask if I am a blind man. They talk nice. They offer tea. And as they phone the highway patrol, I slip out. I know too much. I've thought too long. I've felt too strongly and been lost too often to be found again. That's for me a very powerful line. I've been lost too often to be found again. Mm-hmm. I sleep out, and when I'm awake on that hard, frozen earth, I'll dance my last dance. I'll embrace the prairie winds. I'll dance the winter I have been. I'll finish the winter I suffer. No voices, no bands, no houses, cold and moonlight and a crystal silence, too cold for any howling dog, my dance and winter peace. And that was a student's death in the cold. And then the swimming coach, of course, that was another one. But here's a short one that I just discovered the other day. It was translated into, I think, Japanese. But there was a there's a Brahmin in Cottonwood. He was the head of the North Star Insurance Company, and he and I became kind of buddies. And anyhow, when he was dying, this is a poem about that. It's called Bror, good Scandinavian name. Bror, yeah, Bror Anderson's Birds. In the spring of what Bror knew to be the last year of his life, he put 6 goslings on his pond. He had a big pond in front of his 2-story insurance building. He took joy in their growth. He spoke to everyone of their certain flight and possible return. Their migration became his last parable. And I, for one, will look for the signs of Bror, not in the cemetery amidst marble inscriptions, but in the spring near the horizon on the edge of every bird's wing. And the poem, to my surprise, but maybe not in some deep way, but to my surprise, the family put it on their wall in their house, and the poem meant a lot to them. So in that way, it gives you a sense your poetry. Poetry became my bridge of metaphor, became with my lifelong sense that death was near and faith and hope a true blessing.
And your focus on metaphor has been so powerful for you. It's been one of the major things that I've found in our conversations, and how important metaphor is. And it seems like the difference between writing narrative and writing poetry fits right into the metaphor with poetry much more than it does with narrative for me. But that's just me.
No, you're right. Poetry escapes, that's using one word for it. Poetry escapes prose, and it moves up either into the transcendent or the distant. And I think a helpful thing to understand is meta in Greek is a very powerful prefix. You have words like metamorphosis,
Metaphysics
that goes beyond. It can imply beyond, and the for is sign. So you have metaphor, and I almost like that core sense better than some of the dictionary definitions, just the plain etymology in Greek. It's those words that go beyond. And then it can take a branch of a tree or the bloom of a flower and turn it into a whole lifetime. Whereas a prose writer might take 500 pages to explain how a branch puts out a leaf, and a leaf might put out a bud, and a bud might do a bloom, and it's tied up to photosynthesis. And I mean, what a good botanist can say is wonderful. But it reminds me of the botanist I saw when I was at the University of Michigan. He was going along, and he was showing us everything, and he pointed at poison ivy. It was all over the wall of the Michigan Law Quad, which is a very arty law quad. It's almost like a medieval or a building from 16th century England. And he looked at that and said, some people think that plant causes poison ivy. And he made it sound like some people make that up, or it's just in their minds, or they wouldn't get poison ivy. And as a kid that had poison ivy terribly, I caught it from the winds in the fall. I had special shots. The way they comforted my complaint was, well, when you're 20, you might outgrow it. I thought, holy crap, that guy studied botany all these years to tell me it might be just in my mind. I better get into a science that's better than this. That's a joke, but I enjoyed the joke. All right, then came retirement. And I'm going to describe retirement as sort of good days with Kathy at home and outdoors. I had a chance, if I took a sabbatical, I had to take it in 2002, and then I would retire in 2003. I didn't see a future at the university. And I mean, I could write 4 essays on that, but all the doors were closing. History was closing. Rural studies was closing even more radically and profoundly than I thought. The politics had gotten crummy. And I'd rather go write a book than do politics at the university. And I hope I don't get in trouble, but I'm old enough, I guess I can afford it. And I felt that next generation of students, they weren't fun to teach the way some of the preceding ones were. So anyhow, I took retirement. My closest friends were all gone. And my daily schedule was right in the morning and somewhat intellectually and physically take pleasure in the afternoon. I liked hiking the trails along the Redwood River in the Camden Park's an out-of-the-way park that has a good upland to it and good river trails. It's nice, and the Redwood River is nice, and it's only 6 miles from Marshall. And then on top of that, I was a pretty ardent canoeer. And Kathy then, for retirement, bought me, it was slightly used, a Norwegian bay boat. It was a crafted clinker, which means overlap boards. And it was my retirement gift. It had long oars with leather cuffs on them. It didn't have rowing pins. It had rowing pegs. It was a marvelous boat, fairly heavy, but I put my head down like a good farmer and learned to back up a 2-wheel trailer. And pretty soon I was paddling most of the abundant lakes around. And there were a lot of those little glacial lakes and out to Lake Chetek. And as you would suspect, Jim, my habit of golf returned. I quit golf, but you can't really kind of quit it.
You cannot quit golf.
Yeah, it's hard. And before you knew it, I was back at the Marshall Country Club. I was known to the pro as Back Nine Joe for my solitary play on the backside. And by the way, the backside was a lot tougher and more interesting than the front side. But I like playing golf alone. I might encounter literally a flock of birds circling me. I felt like one day I felt like I forgot the birds, little purple birds, maybe martins, but I felt like I was in the movie Uncle Remus with all those birds circulating them and singing Zippity Doo-Dah or something, but wonderful. Also, I might encounter a hornet in the outdoor toilet, and that always could get your attention. I mean, it was, so anyhow, there was a lot of nature in the course, but then they opened a new 9-hole public course just outside Marshall along the Redwood River. That was my Augusta, or that was my Prestwick. I'd prefer Prestwick in England. That was my Presswick. There was hardly anyone on it. It was fairly inexpensive. And it was a chance to walk and think, scour the rough for balls, find a little sociability in the clubhouse, and it meant a chance to practice and improve my game. And mainly my game was to break 40. I hadn't quite got old enough that in 9 holes I was able to shoot half my age. If I'd ever become a good retired golfer, I wanted to do that. There was a guy in England who had his license plate, a par of the famous English course. I forgot the name at the moment, but he'd shot par below 60 times. So his license kind of wrote 60 minus 73 or something. He had it all figured out. So when I asked, what kind of strange license plate is that? Somebody said, well, he shot his age so many times. So that had stuck with me from my golfing trips. And at the course, I got ideas for poems. I'm going to read a few quick ones if we got time. And
Sure. Go ahead.
Rosie, you want to give me, I think, the Buoyancy book? The title of this book alone is filled with metaphor. Buoyancies. A ballast master, that's the guy that keeps a ship in balance. A ballast master's log. In other words, he's the second captain of the ship. And the biggest metaphor is when you get old, you got to keep a lot of damn stuff in balance. When you're young, you go off the keel, you might say. And you tip over and you can swim. When you're old, you work a long time and the ship is filled with what you want. And you hate to tip over. Okay, but here's some poems. There's one called, this was the first real good collection of my poetry in a book. This is called 3 August Golf Course Poems. They're very short. Inside the plastic outdoor toilet, spiders, wolves of dust ascend and descend. I like the phrase wolves of dust. From an evergreen at the door of the toilet, 2 dragonflies take flight. Like a Vietnam helicopter patrol in search of enemy villages. Suddenly bluebirds, and there I'm back to telling you that story again. Suddenly bluebirds appear, and as they circle me on rising, tilted wings, I walk with light steps. So that's a couple of the poems. And I want to point out my poems never really altogether took off and left my past or my family or my dead. They always tended to want to circle back there. It was as if I was anchored there. And I won't just on time, so I don't take too much time. Michael Palma, a great translator of Dante and poet in his own right, helped me with this first collection. And he wrote a marvelous introduction to my writing. And I did. I was quite flattered. And he wrote, and I'll read just a tiny bit of it, but above all else, this fine collection is a book of people. People precisely evoked and lovingly remembered. Lovingly, but with a far from uncritical eye. Family and friends, neighbors and colleagues, the living and the dead. Especially the dead is underlined by the remarkable quotation from Isadora Duncan's autobiography that serves as the collection's epigraph. And I'm just going to read the Isadora epigraph and not the rest of his praise to my poems in this volume. But here's Isadora Duncan. She was a well-known ballet dancer who got lots of attention. And she wrote a autobiography or a memoir called My Life. She wrote, "Sometime I have a feeling that the dead do not go to a faraway country, nor they hover about us invisible. I have an intuition that at the moment of death, they penetrate, possess us, inhabit us, as if they are strong enough, they subjugate us, or if not, we dominate them, keeping them in the cellars of our subconsciousness, and only allowing them to come out on occasion. What is this flesh but a house large enough, perhaps, to contain many unsuspected gifts?" And that ties up with the first book I wrote on self, One and Many. Those gifts, there's a lot of gifts in us that make us who we are. So I was having a good retirement, and Kathy was having a good retirement. And this section's called Then Out of the Blue. Retirement extended the arc of books and writing. I was content, and Kathy was too. She had satisfactorily returned to work. When our youngest child, Beth, went to school, Kathy loved her role as a public health nurse and found pleasure, friendship, and love in a bell choir, book club, biking, canoeing, and grandchildren. So things went along for Kathy and me until an August day in 2014, when a routine medical checkup produced abnormal blood tests, an abnormal blood test for Kathy. It seems that she had serious deficiencies in her white cell blood count. She was sent to Sioux Falls for additional tests, which resulted in them referring her. There's some bad English here. I straighten out eventually in my 36th draft, and referred her to Mayo for more examinations. At Mayo, Kathy was diagnosed with not one but two blood cancers, myeloma, and yet the more serious lymphoma, meaning a cancer of the lymph. She should be ready for intense and experimental treatments. This left us driving twice a week from Marshall to Rochester and back. Every few months, Kathy was diagnosed. Her treatment had worked. No, her cancers had again aggressively reappeared. It was time again for a new, increasingly experimental chemotherapy to be tried on her unusual case of two blood cancers. At the time she was first diagnosed, her doctor told her there's only 6 cases recorded in Massachusetts like hers. That's all they had the record to work with. Within a year, that's a year of her diagnosis, we left our home in Marshall to live as renters in the Twin Cities. 3 of our children and 5 of our grandchildren lived in the cities, where we had been planning to go for several years. The Twin Cities were only an 80-mile car trip to Mayo rather than 190 from Marshall. So we entered a new chapter of our lives that lasted 7 years until Kathy's death in August 21. And change something here. And so she put up marvelously courageously, and I think we covered that before. and it was prominent for the life. So we get to the very last paragraph, which somewhat abruptly ends this, but maybe you'll have a question or two, and it's 45 minutes. I continue to live in our old apartment. I live by and with family and friends, books and faith, and my habits of solitude. My daily nourishment is memories, writing, and books. I'm grateful for my ability to think and write, and continue to pray and hope for a spring of springs with its promise of a great and lasting reunion. And that obviously could have been elaborated every year.
Sure.
So that's the end. So thank
Well,
you, Jim.
I have some questions though. Just
I'm not getting, you're not letting me get
I'm
out
not
of here.
letting you get out so quickly, Joe. So,
Oh, okay.
but for me, our relationship happens in this last period when you move back to the Twin Cities, because we had met earlier before in the 80s, and then we met again, and you got a chance to meet my wife, who worked with you on some of the books that you've gotten into in self-publishing.
She's done marvelously. Yeah.
And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the book that you wrote that I liked, which you didn't talk very much about, was Buffalo Man. And by the way, I just wanted to tell you that I just saw last night that Ben Franklin wrote a book on farting. So just so that you know that
he did.
He did, yes, the whole book on farting.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I've got a collection of Ben Franklin books. Now I'll cherish them all the more.
But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because you wrote that book too when you were living in, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the place that you and Kathy moved to, because that also stimulated you to write some poems and some other things. But Buffalo Man was written in the Twin Cities, essentially, and talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's written about the Twin Cities, but if you read it, it's very much a river book. It's very much a Minnesota River, Mississippi River book. I mean, the incidents occur. It's about, maybe my French identity snuck through there, but it's about French trappers. It's about Indians who have been interacting with trappers and even missionaries for 5, 6 generations now. And it's a world, but the magic hasn't gone out of that world. The roads aren't paved, and people still want to live along a riverbank. And humor, at least in my take, I've lost a friend or two with my humor. They found it too gross. But my humor didn't fit the more polite history of Minnesota.
Right.
As long as you call Fort Snelling fart smelling, some people find that funny. Other people, it doesn't cost anything. But if you read the book, there's various contests ranging from pushing steamboats off sandbars to trying to find where the water is, where's the water coming from, and they're padding around, and there's contests of all sorts. And then there's a religious theme in the book. And then there is, I hope, in the book, overtones that a new world is coming. It's in St. Paul, it's in Minneapolis. But the last person the Buffalo Man meets on his way up to Quebec to study, he's finally gotten ready for higher ed, and he's going up to Quebec. He meets Thoreau, who's on his way out to see the West before it gets ruined the way New England is ruined. And so they meet, the two crossing of Paul Revere and Buffalo Man. So I'm doing a lot of playing around like that, and I try to make each chapter, as I did in my book on Three Sicilies, my stories, I try to make each chapter a story on itself. So if Buffalo Man goes up to cut white pine, you're going to find out where the white pine forests were, what a white pine is, what a white pine raft look like, how much they use white pine trees, and you're going to find out his encounter. I believe he has an encounter. It's been so long since I wrote it, but I believe he encounters none other than Paul Bunyan up there and goes through a little bit of the Minnesota folklore. So the book has that Rabelais running through it.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I guess the last thing I want to do before we quit is I want you to, we've done 5 of these now, and I just want you to reflect briefly as a closing for us. What did these 5 conversations mean for you in terms of what we've talked about? Is there something that you want to just close with in terms of the importance of having done this kind of conversation over 5 weeks?
Well, the conversation was a marvelous gift to me, starting with my age, which I'm soon to be 86. And I projected even have some chapters for what the 2 following books would be like after Spring of Springs. And they'd be long. They would tend to have too much for my taste in a prose, too much self-adulation or self-concern. And I don't think they'd be really a good read. So to do this, I hope I've made a few good jokes along the way and
you have.
and cause a little bit of air to blow on whoever hears it. And I don't mean flatulence, but a little and not necessarily therapeutic air, but it was a way for me to somewhat skip rather than trudge. So I really appreciated this chance to give 5 talks that are pretty well organized, not developed, the individual talks, but they're pretty well organized that I think if somebody was interested in looking further, there's an outline there and there's a key to which books, which people, but there's a lot of people that would be a kind of a guilt thing when you get writing biographical or autobiographical things. You can develop guilt of people you omit, or you admit something they did for you, but you stress something else. And it's burdensome to be thorough. And what I feel you've done for me for my 86th birthday is you've relieved the burden for 2-3 years of writing any more of myself. And as Rosie could tell you, the next book I'll write will be more in the spirit of going way back. It'll be more in the spirit I'm beginning to feel of the way I organized Death Book. It'll go way back. It'll have poems in it. It'll have some longer essays, but it'll have a lot of very short essays and quick moments. And the effort there is that, and this comes from an Italian writer, when you really write, you want the mind to be able to, you might say, skip rather than trudge. You want it to be able to take leaps now and then. So writing, the kind of writing I prefer tends to be a little smartass, a little light. Maybe some people would say too clever by a step, but it's freer. And I think writing should free the reader too. So I think these talks help the reader. They can make up a Joe Amato or do what is the logical invitation. They can go write their own autobiography. And if they don't want to write it, maybe they'd be inspired to do exactly what we did.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much, and thank Rosie, and I'll be posting this to YouTube. And if anybody is watching this at some point and wants to know more about Joe, he does have a wonderful website, and there's a Wikipedia page, and you can just Google Joe Amato, and you'll find volumes of material on this man. So thank you very much, Joe.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you, Jim. It's been a pleasure doing this with you.
Good.
I owe you a beer. I owe you a beer.
Or at least a poem.
Oh, well, we could. We could work on that.
Okay. Talk to you later.
See ya.